What did poverty do to Victorian mothers and children? The consequences were dire, but I will now reveal all the details. Behind the glittering facade of the Victorian era, with its industrial wonders and imperial grandeur, lay another reality. It was a world where survival was a daily struggle, especially for the most vulnerable. Society demanded that women be guardian angels of the home, but what happened when that home was practically non-existent? We are used to seeing this era through the prism of luxurious balls and the strict morals of the aristocracy. But today we will look behind the scenes of this theater of prosperity into narrow streets and crowded rooms. There, a silent drama unfolded, whose main characters were mothers trying to keep their families together in the grip of poverty. Watch the video to the end to find out how a common cold could spell doom for an entire family, and why the birth of a child was not only a joy, but also a harbinger of despair for many women. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of Victorian society. Even in the most extreme poverty, a Victorian mother had to maintain a facade of respectability. Cleanliness was considered a sign of morality, and dirty clothes or an untidy home could lead to public condemnation. Therefore, women spent their last ounce of strength on washing and cleaning, often using harsh homemade products. A clean apron and a wash threshold were a kind of shield against accusations of laziness and immorality. It was a daily battle for dignity, fought with a bucket and a rag. Even going to church, which was an important part of social life, required a certain appearance. The family had to look decent, even if there was no money left for food. The Sunday suit was the main treasure, which was cherished and resewn many times. The pawnshop was a constant companion to poor families, but it also operated according to its own rules. Items were only accepted if they were clean, so before pawning the last dress, it had to be thoroughly washed. This created a vicious circle of desperate efforts. Maintaining the appearance of order was not just a whim, but a survival strategy. Neighbors, charities, and church trustees judged those in need by their appearance. The chances of receiving help depended directly on how dignified poverty looked. Women became masters of disguise. They knew how to mend clothes so that the patches were almost invisible, and how to make old clothes look new. These skills were as important as the ability to cook a meal from nothing. Even the layout of homes in poor neighborhoods reflected this idea. The living room, if there was one, was kept in perfect order for rare visitors. The real deprived life of the family took place in a tiny kitchen or bedroom. This cult of respectability created enormous psychological pressure. Women felt guilty not only for their family's poverty, but also for their inability to hide it from prying eyes. Every accusation of sloppiness was perceived as a moral condemnation. This theater of cleanliness was a silent cry for help and a desire to remain part of society. Women fought for the right to be considered good mothers and housewives, even when they had no resources to do so. Their efforts remained invisible to high society, which preferred to judge rather than understand. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about how social pressure and the need to save face affected the lives of these women? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what a home for a poor Victorian family looked like? Life on the breadline was closely linked to where people lived, and for the poor, that meant slums. These areas were veritable labyrinths of narrow, dirty streets where sunlight was a rarity. Houses were built as close together as possible without any planning. Often, several families would huddle together in a single room, separated only by thin curtains. Lack of personal space was the norm, affecting all aspects of life. Sanitary conditions were catastrophic. Running water and sewage systems were a luxury unavailable to slum dwellers. Water was drawn from communal taps, which were often located next to cesspools, leading to constant outbreaks of disease. In such conditions, maintaining the cleanliness required by society became a Sisyphean task. Women spent hours carrying water and washing clothes in cold, damp rooms. Their day consisted of an endless struggle with dirt that was impossible to defeat. The rent was disproportionately high for such housing. Landlords took advantage of people's desperate situation, squeezing every last penny out of them. The threat of eviction was a constant nightmare, forcing mothers to accept any job, even the lowest paid ones. For families, there was no such thing as coziness or comfort. The house was not a fortress, but a temporary refuge from the cold and rain. Their entire lives took place in one room. They slept, cooked, worked, and cared for the sick there. The location of the slums near factories and docks had its own grim logic. Workers needed to live close to their jobs because they couldn't afford transportation. Thus, they found themselves trapped in a ring of polluted air and poverty. Mothers tried their best to improve their homes. A potted flower on the windowsill or a clean napkin on the table were small acts of resistance against the dreary reality. These modest attempts to create comfort were a symbol of undying hope. These conditions shaped not only the physical, but also the psychological state of the people. Constant noise, cramped quarters, and lack of privacy wore down the nervous system. It was almost impossible to break out of this cycle. What do you think was the hardest test in such conditions? Physical deprivation or moral pressure? In the next chapter, we will talk about the hidden truth that everyone is silent about, how the ideology of the ideal woman broke the destinies of those who could not live up to it. What you've never seen before, how a popular ideal destroyed lives. The Victorian era gave rise to the cult of the angel in the house. The ideal woman, completely devoted to her family and home. She had to be meek, obedient, and create an atmosphere of peace for her husband. This image was actively promoted in literature, art, and sermons. It became the gold standard of femininity for the middle and upper classes. But for women from poor backgrounds, this ideal was not only unattainable, it was a cruel mockery. A poor mother could not afford to be just an angel. She had to be a worker, a provider, and a manager in conditions of constant crisis. Her hands were far from idle. They were constantly at work, washing, sewing, cooking. The contrast between the ideal and reality gave rise to a deep sense of guilt. Women saw images of serene mothers in clean living rooms in magazines and compared them to their own lives. This made them feel inadequate and like bad housewives. Society did not make allowances for poverty. If a woman worked in a factory, leaving her household, she could be condemned for neglecting her family responsibilities. If she stayed at home, her family would go hungry. There was no right solution to this dilemma. Any choice was a losing one and led to criticism from neighbors or charitable organizations. Women found themselves trapped by conflicting social expectations. Even family relationships were influenced by this ideal. The husband, as the head of the family, expected his wife to create a cozy atmosphere, which was impossible to achieve in an overcrowded room. This became a source of constant conflict and disappointment. Ultimately, this image became yet another burden on the shoulders of poor women. They not only had to struggle with poverty, but also bear the burden of not living up to the imposed ideal. Their real hard work to keep their families alive remained invisible and unappreciated. What if I showed you a time machine and we looked at the plate of a poor Victorian family? Food was essential for survival, but the diet of the poor was extremely meager and monotonous. It depended entirely on earnings, which were unstable and varied from week to week. The main food on the table was bread. It was the cheapest source of calories, so it was consumed in huge quantities. However, the quality of this bread was very low, and foreign substances were often mixed into it to increase its weight. Meat was a rarity and a luxury. If it did appear on the table, it was in the form of the cheapest trimmings or offal. Most often, it was used to make broth to add flavor to other dishes. The diet consisted mainly of potatoes, cabbage, and other cheap vegetables. They were boiled or stewed to make simple and not very nutritious soups. Such a diet led to a chronic lack of vitamins and protein. Tea was an important part of the diet, but not in the form we are accustomed to. The poor drank very weak tea, often brewing the same leaves several times. It gave the illusion of warmth and satiety, but had no nutritional value. Sugar was also an expensive treat. It was used very sparingly, mainly added to tea. Sweet foods were only available on major holidays if enough money could be saved up for them. Mothers often gave the best pieces to their husbands, who did hard physical labor. It was believed that the main breadwinner should receive more food. The women themselves and their offspring ate whatever was left over. Chronic malnutrition was the norm. It undermined health, making people vulnerable to all kinds of diseases. Fatigue and apathy were constant companions for those who lived on such a diet. Do you think it was possible to survive in such conditions without losing hope? In the next chapter, you will learn what kind of work women had to accept in order to feed their families. For women from the lower classes, work was not a choice, but a necessity. However, the labor market offered them only the most difficult and low-paid options. Their labor was vital for the survival of their families, but at the same time remained virtually invisible to society. One of the most common types of employment was home-based work. Women took orders for sewing clothes, making artificial flowers, or boxes. This allowed them to look after their homes and children at the same time. The conditions of such work were grueling. They had to work 12-16 hours a day by the dim light of a candle or kerosene lamp. Payment was piecework and so low that it was necessary to work to exhaustion to earn a minimum wage. Another common occupation was laundry. Women took laundry from wealthier homes to wash. It was hard physical labor that required hours of boiling, rinsing, and ironing in damp, poorly ventilated rooms. Many women worked as servants in middle-class homes. This provided a stable, albeit small, income, and sometimes even housing. However, they were completely dependent on the mercy of their employers and were often subjected to humiliation. With the development of industry, women went to work in factories, especially textile factories. Working at a machine was monotonous and dangerous. Long working days, high injury rates, and deafening noise were the norm. Women were paid significantly less than men for the same work. Their earnings were considered to be merely a supplement to their husband's income, even if in reality they were the main source of livelihood. This discrimination was legalized and unquestioned. This exhausting work left no time or energy for anything else. Education, leisure, and recreation were all unaffordable luxuries. Life became an endless cycle of work and sleep, with no hope for change. Are you ready for the shocking truth about what the state considered help? In 1834, a new poor law was passed that radically changed the system of assistance to the needy. Its main goal was not to help, but to force the poor to work at any cost. Under this law, any assistance outside the walls of the workhouse was virtually abolished. If a family could not feed itself, its only option was to go to this institution. The mere mention of the workhouse was enough to cause horror. Conditions in workhouses were deliberately made unbearable. It was believed that only extreme need could force a person to seek refuge there. Life in them was stricter than in prison. Families were separated upon admission. Husbands were separated from their wives and parents from their children. This was done to break people's will and prevent them from reproducing at the expense of the state. The day was scheduled down to the minute. Hard, monotonous, and meaningless labor, meager food, and strict discipline were the main elements of this system. Any violation of the rules was punished severely, for example, by deprivation of food. For mothers, separation from their children was the most terrible ordeal. They could only see them occasionally, during short visits under the supervision of guards. This cruelty was justified by the idea that poor people were bad parents. The workhouse was not just a place, but a symbol of complete social failure. To end up there meant losing everything: freedom, family, human dignity. Therefore, people were willing to do anything to avoid this fate. The threat of the workhouse forced people to agree to the most terrible working conditions and the lowest wages. This was beneficial to factory and business owners. The system created an army of desperate workers who were ready for anything. What was worse, hunger in freedom or satiety in captivity? In the next chapter, we will learn what chances for the future society gave to children from poor families. Access to education in the Victorian era was strictly divided along class lines. For children from wealthy families, there were private schools and home tutors. For poor children, school was a luxury their parents could not afford. Although there were charitable and church schools for the poor, there were not enough of them. In addition, even free education was a problem for families. A child in school meant that he or she was not working and not bringing in any income. Many parents simply did not see the point of education. They themselves were illiterate and believed that it was more important for their children to learn a trade. The ability to read and write seemed like a useless skill in the struggle for survival. The quality of education in schools for the poor was very low. Classes were overcrowded, and there was a shortage of textbooks and materials. Teachers were often poorly trained and unable to give each student individual attention. The main emphasis was on religious education and memorization. Children were taught to be obedient, hardworking, and to know their place in society. Critical thinking and creativity were not encouraged. The situation was even more difficult for girls. It was believed that they needed less education than boys. They were prepared for their future roles as wives and mothers, mainly by being taught housekeeping skills. Only at the end of the era, with the adoption of laws on compulsory primary education, did the situation begin to change. The state realized that an illiterate population was hindering industrial development. However, even after that, many children attended school irregularly. Thus, the education system did not smooth out social inequality, but rather reinforced it. It reproduced the class structure of society, predetermining a child's life path depending on their origin. The chance for a better future was practically zero. In a situation where the state offered only a punitive system of workhouses, the poor survived thanks to their own informal support networks. Neighborly mutual aid was not just a kind gesture, but a vital strategy. Women were most often at its center and driving force. Mothers created a complex system of mutual services. One might look after her neighbor's children while she looked for work. Another would share information about where to buy cheaper groceries. In case of illness, the whole street could come to the rescue. Neighbors took turns caring for the sick, bringing food and helping with cleaning and laundry. This was the only medical care available. The birth of a child was also a community event. Experienced women helped the young mother during childbirth and in the first weeks after. They shared advice, clothes for the newborn, and moral support. There were also informal credit systems. Women could borrow small amounts of money from each other until payday to buy food or pay for housing. Such debts were always repaid, as reputation and future trust depended on it. Church parishes and charitable organizations also provided assistance. However, their resources were limited, and they often imposed strict requirements on the behavior and moral character of those in need. It was not easy to obtain such assistance. Pawn shops played a dual role. On the one hand, they were the only way to get cash quickly. On the other hand, their high interest rates often drove families into debt. It was this invisible social fabric, woven from daily acts of kindness and mutual aid, that allowed poor families to stay afloat. It was their main asset in a world where they had nothing else. Women were the guardians of this asset. The life of a poor Victorian mother was a lesson in constant and meticulous thrift. Every penny earned was counted. Budgeting in the face of unstable income was a fine art on which the family's survival depended. The main expense was rent. It had to be paid weekly, and any delay could lead to immediate eviction. Therefore, money for rent was set aside first, even if it meant saving on food. Buying coal for heating and cooking was another major expense, especially in winter. Families bought coal in small portions, which was much more expensive per weight, but they didn't have the money to buy a large bag at once. Clothes were almost never bought new. They were purchased in second-hand shops, received from charities, or from more fortunate relatives. The ability to alter and repair clothes was a must for every woman. There was a whole system of funeral clubs. Families contributed a small amount to a common fund each week. This ensured that in the event of the death of a family member, they would have money for a decent funeral, which was extremely important in terms of reputation. Even entertainment, if there was any, was subject to strict economy. A trip to the music hall or pub was a rare event. Most often, leisure time was limited to walks or socializing with neighbors. Women were the real financial managers of their families. They knew the prices of all the goods in the area and would walk several kilometers to save half a penny. Their minds were constantly occupied with complex calculations. This daily struggle for every penny was physically and mentally exhausting. It left no room for dreams or plans for the future. Their entire lives were focused on one task: surviving until the next week. The heaviest burden for the Victorian poor was not only the lack of money, but also the attitude of society towards them. In that era, poverty was not considered a social problem. It was seen as the result of personal vices, laziness, drunkenness, and a lack of morality. This ideology was actively supported by the middle and upper classes. It allowed them to justify the existing social inequality. If the poor were themselves to blame for their situation, then there was no need to help them. Charity was often humiliating. Before receiving assistance, those in need had to prove their worthiness. Their homes were inspected, and they were questioned about their habits and lifestyle. Women bore the double burden of these prejudices. They were judged not only as poor people, but also as mothers and housewives. Any disorder in the home or the untidy appearance of children was seen as proof of their incompetence. Popular literature and the press often created an image of the undeserving poor. They were lazy and cunning people who tried to cheat generous benefactors. This stereotype shaped public opinion and mistrust. Politicians and economists of the time argued that any assistance only corrupted the poor. They believed that only the threat of starvation could force a person to work. This theory formed the basis of the cruel poor law. Even medical care was permeated by this attitude. Doctors in hospitals for the poor often treated patients with contempt. It was believed that their illnesses were the result of their own immoral lifestyle. Thus, the fight against poverty was also a fight against prejudice. To receive assistance, one had to conform to the image of a humble and grateful poor person. Any display of pride or discontent could lead to a refusal of support. We have lifted the veil on a side of the Victorian era that is not often written about in textbooks. Behind the facade of progress and prosperity lay a daily struggle for survival waged by millions of women. Their resilience, ingenuity, and quiet heroism deserve no less attention than the achievements of great politicians and inventors. The story of these mothers is a stark reminder of how social and economic conditions affect the very foundations of human life. It teaches us that poverty is not a moral failing, but a complex systemic problem. Society's ideals and expectations can become an unbearable burden when they are detached from reality. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. What other hidden pages of history should we uncover together? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the past.